All right, welcome back to the Fuse Show, everybody. My name is Bud. I am the head of culture at xfusion.io and co-host of the Fuse Show. I am excited to be joined today by my guest, Malinka Walaliyadde. Malinka is co-founder and CEO of AKASA, the leading developer of AI for healthcare operations. AKASA scales human intelligence with cutting-edge AI to automate and optimize operational infrastructure at healthcare systems. Malinka, thanks for being on the show today, buddy. How you doing?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Hey, we have a lot to talk about today. You guys have thrown a lot of numbers at me that are, they kind of hit me in the face, and they are shocking. But before we get into that, I just kind of want to get into your journey a little bit. You have had quite a journey to get to where you're at. From my understanding, you were born in Sri Lanka, you grew up in the UAE, and made your way over here. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Sure. Happy to do that. So, born in Colombo, capital city in Sri Lanka, spent the first few years of my life there. My parents moved over to the UAE and specifically a small city there called Sharjah when I was young, primarily because, there was a fairly large civil war in Sri Lanka at the time, not a great place to grow up. Spent most of my life growing up in Sharjah in the UAE, and it was an interesting experience growing up there. There's probably an entire podcast we could do about the what it's like to grow up in the UAE. But what was interesting to me was I had the internet available to me at the time there, right, growing up, which meant that I could really get a sense of what it looked like outside the UAE. For a young, super ambitious person, at least at the time, and I'm sure the US changed now, there wasn't a lot of interesting things that a person could get involved with while over there. But, I realized that everything I wanted to do and build was available in the United States. And so I made it my mission to get to the United States to study, and was able to do that. Went to Cornell for my undergraduate degree. And that was an incredible experience. Just the opportunity set is orders of magnitude beyond what I'd seen in the UAE, and I took full advantage of it. I got involved in a lot of different activities. I was very interested in material science and genetic engineering, and so I did a lot of work along those lines while I was at Cornell. And really, actually, coming to Cornell and coming there for college was actually the first time I'd met an American before, because it's interesting. There aren't very many people from the U.S. in the UAE, but it was everyone was incredibly welcoming, and I, as I mentioned, got involved in a lot of different activities. What I realized very quickly, though, was that software was where meaningful development was going to occur, at least in my lifetime, or at least in the near-term lifetime that I could see. I was very, very interested in the biotech world, and there's lots of great advancement there. The cycle time, though, is very long. What I mean by that is going from idea to something out in production is longer in probably any other field of engineering outside of software engineering. And so I realized that I wanted to go down that path. And then I found a mentor who I learned a lot from while towards the end of my time at Cornell. Came out to Silicon Valley as a function of that, and eventually found myself at A16Z, or Andreessen Horowitz, a large venture capital firm based out of Silicon Valley. They manage, I think, close to $20 billion in assets under management today. I helped them start the healthcare investing team several years ago. That's now grown into a very sizable operation there, which has been just wonderful to see. I worked on about $250 million worth of investments across about 20 companies while I was there. And so, anyway, I'll pause there because I think I covered your question and then some, and happy to talk through a little bit more if helpful.
Yeah, you did. You covered a few of my questions, which is fine. That's awesome. I do want to go back a little bit to when you were coming over here. Like, was that a hard was that a hard conversation, like, to have with your parents, to say, hey, I want to come over to the States? Did you come over by yourself? Was, like, how was that being an immigrant?
Yeah.
And did that differ when you got here compared to what you thought it was going to be?
The conversation with my parents was challenging in that I think for any parent, having their child go very far away is challenging. But they've always been incredibly supportive of me. I've been very fortunate in that regard. So that wasn't a crazy hard conversation to have. In terms of what I thought I was going to expect here, I didn't really know, right? Like, I mean, literally all I knew about the US was from, American TV shows and movies, and the internet, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have that many expectations coming in, but coming in, I will say I was just extremely pleasantly surprised by how welcoming everyone was. It was my first time in the United States, and so I didn't really see much of it when I came in. Right, we, if you know, Cornell's in Ithaca, which is about 5 hours north of New York or something. It's very hard to get to and a little bit of a pain, but it's a beautiful place. You fly into JFK or something, which is the closest international airport, and then you can take a short flight up or take the bus up or whatever. So it was great. And then I made some very good friends in my first year, and they were kind enough to, many of them I'm still very, very good friends with, and they were kind enough to invite me to their places for the Thanksgivings, which was a new thing for me, right? I think that first October is when I first had pumpkin pie ever in my life, and I realized I have really a huge liking for it, and I've been a fan of it since. But yeah, I was fortunate to make some very good friends who really made me feel at home, even though my immediate family was very, very far away.
Nice. So then you get to Cornell, you start studying. When biomedical engineering, materials engineering, like, what was your schooling like in the UAE that put you on this path? I don't know what it's like over in the UAE. You said that you did have the internet. When did you know that this was the path that you wanted to go down?
There's an author, Michael Crichton. Many folks are familiar with him. He wrote the Jurassic Park books and a bunch of other books, just very heavy science focused books. And I've always been a fan of his. And all his books really talk about the future that is possible with deep focus on engineering from a very first principles level. And so my interest in material science and biomedical engineering came from, understanding how to engineer the fundamental bits of organic and inorganic matter, right? So material science, nanotech is, understanding how things work at an atoms level and changing the features of inorganic matter through that. Biomedical engineering, genetic engineering is doing that at the DNA level, which is the equivalent, and being able to make changes at the in organic forms. And so that was a common thread for me that made me very interested in both those areas. And so that's what drove me to getting interested in those areas and getting into, a lot of student research while I was early on at Cornell. Yeah, those are some of the primary drivers for me.
Okay, so you said, when you were young, you were obviously driven. You get over to the U.S., you get in Cornell, you're driven, you get these engineering degrees. So fast forward, you go from Ithaca, New York, over to San Francisco.
A16Z.
Yeah, yep. You get hooked up with Andreessen Horowitz, and now you are on your way, right? Now, what exactly were you doing with Andreessen Horowitz? Because this lines up with exactly how you got hooked up with AKASA, with why you started AKASA. from what I can gather in studying you, correct?
Sure. So, I mean, there's actually things prior to that informed me going into starting AKASA as well. Even prior to A16Z, everything that I spent some time at a consulting firm called Deloitte, where I was on their healthcare and life sciences group. And what became clear to me before, and especially became clear to me at A16Z, was that there's a lot of great innovation on the care side of healthcare, right? I like to say, I think the US healthcare system has the best medicine, or American medicine is the best in the world, but the American healthcare system is really not.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of where there's a lot of pain that is still not being addressed today, I think it is on the back end of the US healthcare system, in the operational and infrastructure layer, that's really largely being ignored. And so there were a lot of data points along the way that informed my thinking, and then they all sort of coalesced and centralized while I was at A16Z. And I could talk a little bit about more of what I saw there as well.
Yeah. Why don't you? Because I think that will inform the viewer of why you went ahead and started AKASA and went ahead and built AKASA. I think it's important for this background, because we'll ask why you built AKASA, and then we'll get into exactly what AKASA is. And I think it's really important to understand the background before we get into what AKASA actually does.
Sure. So when I was at A16Z, a lot of the companies I saw were companies that were focused on, some new care modality or something on the front end of care, which is important, and there's lots of pain there, obviously. Mm-hmm. But what became clear is, even in the companies we invested in our portfolio, at some point they would need to plug into the financial infrastructure of healthcare and the operational infrastructure of healthcare and figure out scale. And that meant they needed to figure out how this financial infrastructure system worked, right? And for all those companies, they would do the same exact thing, which is they would, try and build it themselves in-house. It would be very painful. They would realize, oh my God, this is like this completely new muscle that we have to build that's important. And it was the same thing over and over again. And it wasn't clear that there was a good way to do this at that level. And then on the other side, we also had had relationships with executives at large health systems who would complain about the same set of issues. And it became clear, even at that scale, right, like these giant health systems that have been around for a long time and have, huge teams, still don't have a great way to solve these problems in a meaningful way. And then at some point it became clear, look, there are ways to solve these problems using modern machine learning approaches that should take us to a fundamentally better place from an operations perspective and infrastructure perspective. It's a very esoteric area, which I think is why a lot of technologists don't typically get into it, because it's not the obvious thing, right? Mm-hmm. The obvious thing for a technologist in Silicon Valley is, I'm going to try and cure X disease, which is obviously important, and people should absolutely work on that. What they're not aware of is, look, on the back end of healthcare, in, for example, the billing area or another core operational area, these pain points that are only known to administrators at those health systems, they're still a huge problem, right? There's, literally tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars spent in these areas trying to have a more efficient operational infrastructure. But it's I think it's vastly underserved by modern technologists.
Yeah.
And so when that became clear, I, along with my co-founders, started AKASA to go solve those problems.
Yeah. And you had a unique look at it, being with, A16Z, to be able to look at the companies that you were investing in and seeing what was actually going on, going, hey, there's really a problem here that we could actually solve by building AKASA.
Yes.
So I mean,
that, and also it was a great way for us to connect with, health system executives. Because like the fundamental thing is you really need to talk to the people, the customers that are actually feeling the pain. And so I had this incredible opportunity to really talk at scale and understand at scale what it looked like for a number of these health systems. And that was just super, super helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so we kind of got into a little bit about what you do there at AKASA. Let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into why, what exactly you do and really the genesis of AKASA.
Sure. So we use a unique combination of AI, bots, and a human in the loop to automate complex operations in healthcare. Where we've started is in the revenue cycle at health systems. And the customer experience is very simple, right? They don't need to train their staff. We're not giving them a tool for their staff to use that they need to retrain their staff on. We can deliver effectively a service that can automate the work for them wholesale, right? And they just don't need to worry about it. It makes it very simple for them to understand what it is we do and to realize the value. Because for a lot of tools that are workflow tools that staff need to use, it's actually now the customer's responsibility in many cases to train their staff to use this new thing, right? And frankly, staff just don't want to, right? They're just so busy with everything they need to do. And a lot of the times the work they're doing is just super repetitive and manual and laborious and like not fun work for the staff either, right? And so what we can do is just completely eliminate a lot of this mindless activity that they're being forced to do and have them work at the top of their license, do the most important work, which is also the most interesting.
Here's where we get into some of these numbers that I was talking about right at the beginning of the show. In 2019, the U.S. spent about $3.8 trillion on healthcare, or approximately $11,582 per person. And on administrative costs, there was $266 billion of wasteful spending in healthcare. How is AKASA helping that number?
Sure. So much of the friction in our system is because the payers or healthcare insurance companies don't fully trust the providers or hospitals, and the providers don't fully trust the payers. And instead of trusting each other, they're often spending these massive amounts of money to try and figure out what is the actual correct number that should be paid or should have been paid or whatever. And it requires just these armies of people doing very monotonous, laborious tasks to get to something which we should be able to get through software, which is what is accurate, what is correct and fair, right? And so by using software to get to ground truth more accurately, more quickly, with way fewer staff, we should be able to eliminate a huge amount of this unnecessary administrative activity that is happening.
Yeah, and there's, on your website, it also says that about 50% of claims are turned back to the insurance. Now,
50% of claims are
denied.
So it's right. Actually, it's closer to, I would say, about 10%. I want to make sure. About 10% of initially submitted claims are denied upon initial submission. But off that set, about 50% get paid after denial.
Okay. All right. Sorry, I misunderstood.
But it's still
number.
A large number.
Yeah,
I mean, even 10% is crazy. That's a lot of work for a lot of people.
So, that being said, again, sorry, I misunderstood that number. Don't want to put bad information out there. that being said, like, how can AI and what you do at AKASA, make that number better? Like, you can use AI to make that number, that 10%, go down, can you not?
Correct. We absolutely can. And let me actually talk through a couple of other implications of that number, right? Because when you have something get denied initially by the payer, in most cases, the provider should be doing something to overturn that, right? But in some cases, if the provider is not moving as quickly or something along those lines, the patient may get hit with a bill saying, hey, this was actually not covered. And it might be not something that the patient really should be responsible for, right? It could have been an error up front, right? And we see this a bunch where the patient, when you go to a hospital, they scan your insurance card, right? The reason they scan your insurance card is because they want to make sure they have the most recent insurance coverage for you on file. But sometimes the people at the front desk may not update your patient account with the information on your most recent insurance card. So they literally have the file in the system, but they just haven't updated the account. So then after the patient visits, etc., and the claim is submitted to the payer, it might actually get submitted to an old payer that is no longer valid, right? And so that would contribute to one of these denials I'm talking about, right?
Okay.
And so the denial comes back. The provider is at that point going, okay, do we have a more recent insurance card on file? They might find it if they had scanned it, and then they say, whoops, we just didn't upload the account with this, and we're going to do that. They update it with the right pair, and then they submit it to the right pair, and then that should take care of it, right? And so one of the things we're doing with AI up front is always making sure we have the most accurate insurance coverage for the patient on file based on whatever scans are available in the system, right? So that's a very an example of how we can reduce that number from 10% to lower. And and we're having actually a couple of effects here. One is we're just reducing the back and forth, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you want to get clean claims as much as possible, right? It just reduces work for both sides. Second, it reduces, anxiety for the patient, because if the patient gets a notification that, hey, this was denied, now they might go, wait, do I actually have to pay something meaningful now? But it was actually an error in the process that caused this, right? So we can just significantly reduce the number of times patients get unnecessarily concerned as well. So hopefully that's a helpful example of what it looks like to reduce that number.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually going through that right now. My wife's grandmother just moved in with us. She's 83. Okay. And we got something in the mail a few weeks ago saying, this was denied. And my wife spent, 3.5 weeks calling and going back and forth, and it ended up that it wasn't denied. And I don't know what the reason was. I'd have to talk to her to figure it out, but it was actually covered. And all this while, 83-year-old grandma is freaking out that she was going to have to pay, $13,000 for this bill that was covered, and it was a $50 bill actually. So
that's just not right. Yeah. I mean, that's we hear stories like that all the time, unfortunately, right? I forget the stat, but it's a very large fraction of Americans have had an incorrect medical bill, sometime in the last year or so. There was a great study done. I forget exactly where it was, but that unfortunately is true. And then the other fact that's unfortunately true is that the number one cause of personal bankruptcy in the U.S. is a medical bill.
Yeah, I saw that. It's like 67% of bankruptcies have to do with medical bills. That's a crazy stat. So, companies like AKASA and AKASA, itself, like there's a trust issue right now with the medical field, and like you said, the U.S.'s medicine is the best medicine in the world, right? But our medical field
system,
our medical system is lacking. So what you're doing is trying to help fix the medical system. But how do you see AKASA helping Americans regain the trust in the medical system?
So I think trust comes out of consistency, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you can rely on having the same consistent experience every single time, that's how you establish trust. And today that's not the case, because a lot of the moving pieces, we have a lot of moving pieces, and each of those are overseen or managed by a person. It's far too manual. People make mistakes, especially when they're doing, activities that are fundamentally fairly monotonous, right? And in order for us to get to consistency, we need to have software do this work. Software, if it's set up correctly, doesn't make mistakes. It is much more reliable, much more consistent. So that is a fundamental belief we have, right? Anywhere we see a lot of people doing computer work, that's not great. We should have computers do computer work, and we should have people do people work.
Mm-hmm.
So once we get to that state, we can establish consistently, which I think is a fundamentally necessary to establish trust.
I like that. And where do you see your current industry falling short? And where do you see your industry picking up in the future? Does that make sense how I asked that?
I think so. And when you say our industry, do you mean, our AI and automation in healthcare industry,
yes,
or healthcare more broadly?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me talk through just sort of the history of the industry at a very high level first. So the last couple of decades of technology in our industry have been workflow tools to help staff be faster. And that was great, right? Mm-hmm. It helped staff go faster. At this point, I think that's relatively saturated. Staff are probably as fast as they're going to get. They also just don't want to learn a new tool. More recently, there's been a wave, and this is just not just in healthcare, but broadly across the enterprise, around this set of technologies called RPA, or robotic process automation. Mm-hmm. And there are a large number of companies that do this, some horizontally, some specifically in healthcare. And the general idea is developing software or a bot that can operate on top of existing workflow tools and operate them like a human would. This has some fundamental benefits in that there's no ripping and replacing, right? You're not trying to move the system of record entirely or something like that. That's enormously painful, especially in healthcare. And there's a number of other benefits I can talk about, right? But the way we think about it is there was this layer that was built, these workflow tools that were built over the last couple of decades, this layer that's mostly saturated. There's a layer on top of that, which is the staff layer, right? Mm-hmm. And these are staff that need to use this tool. And so we're operating at that staff layer because we can deliver, effectively virtual FTEs that can do the same type of work. That's the general idea behind the broader RPA industry. What we have done is taken it to the next level, where we have infused AI and a human into the loop into this approach so that we can automate far more complex operations and do it far more reliably. Our automation does not go down because we have built this really seamless way to plug in a human if our AI ever sees something it's not comfortable with. And I'm happy to talk about that in as much detail as is interesting. But that's sort of how we exist in our industry.
That sounds all well and good. Why hasn't everybody adopted this yet? Are you well on your way to having everybody adopting this? Yes. I mean, the company's fairly... we've grown very quickly in a very short period of time. About 10%, our customer base represents about
10% of all US health system spend. So about $115 billion in NPR.
Great.
So that's a fairly large chunk to get to in a fairly short period of time. And I think the reason for that is because our solution is fundamentally differentiated in the market and is resonating very strongly.
Good.
So there's still a ways to go, but it's been an incredible start.
No, that is an incredible start. So in the next 5 years or so, where do you see this thing being at? You know, where do you see not just AKASA, but AI in the healthcare industry being at? Sure.
I'll talk about AKASA briefly and talk about AI more broadly beyond that. Where we've started, the automation system that we have developed, which is this unique combination of AI, bots, and a human in the loop, is actually not specific to revenue cycle, right? Mm-hmm. We started in revenue cycle because it is one of the most complex and challenging areas of a health system's back end, and where we see a lot of the pain. And so it was an obvious place to start. But we can apply that same approach to a lot of other operational areas at both health systems as well as at payers. So those are some of the areas we're going to get into across those areas. From an AI more broadly perspective, we believe there's going to be a significantly higher uptick across all functions really, because the fundamental challenge that we are going to see is that we just do not have enough people to do the work that we need to do.
Okay.
We are seeing that this year, or rather last year, 2021, was a crazy year for everyone.
Right.
But especially from a labor, crazy being the understatement of the year probably, but from a labor staffing perspective especially, it was very challenging, right? So in healthcare, labor costs, healthcare staffing has always been a challenge first, right? It's always been a challenge. But in 2021, it became critical. Healthcare staffing costs went up about 13% year over year. Despite that increase, the average staffing actually went down by 5%. So literally, it's like both of those things have gone in the opposite direction of what you as a manager of a manager or leader of a health system would want.
Right.
What that means is that we just cannot do things the old way. Like they just straight up cannot do things the old way. They have to do it a new way, right? And in that new way, automation is a very, very large part of it, because we have to get much more leverage on the small staff we have, because it's not going to work otherwise. So it's now become, the conversations we have with health systems have actually changed meaningfully, right? It's a lot more urgent now, because they just cannot get the work done. And when we're delivering automation that allows them to leverage this, effectively get new virtual FTEs at scale, that's incredible, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not just for us, but I think for other AI companies too. If you look at a lot of the care-oriented companies out there, they actually are following a very similar concept if they're delivering some sort of virtual care. So if you look at, let's say, the diabetes management space, so there is, or weight management, there's a few large companies, right? There's Omada Health. There's another company called Livongo that was acquired by Teladoc. There's a more direct-to-consumer one called Noom. And these are all large, very successful companies that use technology leverage coaches to treat patients, right? Mm-hmm. And the fundamental thing they've done is they've used technology and AI to enable a smaller staff of coaches to manage a much larger patient or member pool than a typical provider outside of one of these systems. Because that's what we need to do, right? We just do not have enough people to deliver the right level of care without technology. We need to significantly increase the ratio of care provider to care receiver, and the only way to do that, the only way it's ever been possible to do that in any industry, is through technology leverage. And AI is a new form of technology leverage that is more powerful than prior forms of technology leverage. It allows us to increase that ratio significantly without really compromising on their care quality. And so that's already happening across the board. We are doing it with operations. Other people are doing it with care. And we're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah. You know, here at Xfusion, one of our, taglines or claim to fame is we help our customers get back to the highest and best use of their time. And that sounds exactly like what you're doing with your clients. You know, you're helping them get back to the highest and best use of their time.
Yes.
I am fairly new in the tech space. You know, I was not in tech until March of last year. And I was very leery of anything AI. You know, I'm having been in the tech space now and having done several of these interviews with people that make AI and live AI. Like, you know, I love AI. I'm not really afraid of it anymore, you know. Because that's really what it was a little bit of fear, you know, and AI is going to take over the world, you know, just ignorance. But no, this sounds amazing. One thing I do want to know is I'd really like to know how you built your team, because this had to have been a little bit tough. Like, this is a very technically challenging product, but at the same time, you're going into the healthcare field. Like, how did you marry those two, you know, different fields together when you were building this team to make this product?
We've been very deliberate in building our team to include experts from both the deep healthcare world as well as best-in-class technology, right? So our technology folks are from some of the, you know, great Silicon Valley technology companies out there, right? You know, the Facebook schools, etc. And then our healthcare folks, who bring a lot of the domain experience and ability to really peer-to-peer interact with health system leaders, are from places like, you know, Optum, the advisory board, places like that, that folks in healthcare are familiar with. And look, it sounds like the most obvious thing in the world, right? To say you should have a team that has both, right? That seems like a very obvious thing to do. It's actually very, very hard to do in practice.
Yeah.
Here's why, right? The reason it's hard to do in practice is, look, as when you're starting a company or you're a leader of a company, it's very easy to go down the path of least resistance, right? If you need to grow fast or do something fast, it's easier to go down the path of least resistance. And, you know, usually the founders of a company have, you know, they have networks in whatever domain they were in, right? So if you're, let's say, a founder from the technology world, like core enterprise technology world or something, and you're building your team, it's very easy to keep pulling people in from that world because that's your network and that's what you know. But if you're not careful, what happens then is your team gets overly, like the composition of your team is overly focused with that background and not with this other background that's actually very important, like a healthcare consulting or services background or something like that. And then you try to correct it afterwards, but it's very hard because, you know, it's hard to get new people to join from that background because they don't see as many people with that background in your company, right? And it creates this loop where it becomes hard to break out of. So you have to really be very thoughtful and deliberate from the beginning and sort of stop yourself from going down the path of least resistance and actually be deliberate about pulling in a team that is diverse in all respects, right? And so that's something that we have that was very important to us early on. It's something that I had seen even from my days at ACC&Z, where, you know, a common mode of failure is, and this is actually less common now. There's a lot of really great technology companies that are more balanced now than they used to be. But a common mode of failure in the past was a couple of people from the tech world who have zero background in healthcare, you know, starting a healthcare company, trying to solve problems in healthcare, and just hitting a wall because they just have no idea what it looks like to commercialize something in healthcare. These days, I'm seeing that less because there are now a lot of health tech companies that were built with the same principles in mind, right? The health tech companies themselves have people that were balanced between tech and healthcare folks. And so if you grew up or you had your career in one of those companies, you're actually really well set up to build something meaningful in this space. And there's a more alumni or alum from those companies now starting COs. So that's all good. It's all very promising and good for the industry, but it's still, when you're actually on the ground and, growing quickly, it's something you have to stop yourself really be deliberate on as you're constructing or building the team.
Yeah. I was just, just from my experience and people that don't know, I was just thinking, people in healthcare seem to be much more people, and people on the tech side, especially like on the engineering side, engineers are an animal of their own, and I deal with that here. Like, one of my co-founders is an engineer, and the other one is very much more on the people person side. And it's just funny, because they're just like oil and water at times. And I'm like, how in the world did you build a team to be able to hit both sides? And good job.
I'll say it's challenging for sure, right? But this is actually not a problem, I think, just in healthcare, but broadly across any type of sort of enterprise-facing company where, you have a commercial team that has a very different life from someone on the engineering team. Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm proud of is they do both get each other quite, I think, better than I've seen at other companies. Like many of our engineers are commercially minded, understand how what they're doing can impact a customer, right? Because at the heart of it, right, the thing that connects all of these people is the customer, right? That connects all of these people. The engineers know what they're building ultimately needs to benefit the customer. The salespeople know whatever we're selling ultimately needs to deliver value to the customer. We have made delivering happiness to our customer one of our extremely core parts of the company. And so having done that from early on made it easier to align both these folks. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still absolutely, challenges and things that we have to work through because they do have very different day-to-day lives. But I think aligning on delivering value to the customer has solved a lot of those problems up front.
Well, and just making sure they don't silo, making sure that they're able to connect while they're at work, and don't silo from each other is an important detail. And keeping that customer facing is integral to that. So, no, good job.
It is.
And
it's super hard to not have silos, especially these days when everyone is remote. I'm constantly, like, if, people will often ask me what keeps me up. And one of the things is I just think about the experience for a new hire, right? If you were a new hire right now at not just our company, but any company, right? You start your first week or couple of weeks is you talk to your manager, maybe some people on your direct team, and that's it, right? Like that's basically it. You don't benefit from the learning by osmosis of just being in an office and talking to people. And so, how do you even know what the company does? It's so hard. And so I think about that a lot. And so across last summer, we actually spent some time where we had every department head put together a video of here's what our department does. Here's what we do. Here's how we work with other people. And then we have this curriculum of, videos, right? Here's what each department does. And that's a fundamental piece of every new hire's onboarding. We need to do more there. But I think about that a lot. How people actually know what the company does, really, how people can understand what other departments are doing. because that is just a huge part of job satisfaction.
Yeah, it is. And, that's close to my heart, being the head of culture here. We,
right. Yeah.
We're at 52. And so one of the things that we started is I'm able to get on a half-hour call each week, or each month, with every one of our employees. Now, I can do that now, but what happens when we get to 75? What happens when we get to 100? Like, I'm not going to be able to do that, and we've decided that once that hits every 6 weeks, like, that's going to be too long of a time, so how do we scale that? But that has really helped, because most of our people are in Kenya and the Philippines, and we have...
So you have to deal with time zone differences as well, which is very hard.
Absolutely. We have one in Jamaica, one in India, but most of them are in Kenya and the Philippines. And it's really great because we get all the different backgrounds and things like that, but they really appreciate that, so I mean, that's something to think about too. But they really like the fact that they have somebody that gets on a call with them once a month and brings the culture around and brings questions around, and they can talk to somebody. But I mean, you're not doing bad. You earned the 2021 Great Place to Work certification for the second year in a row. Like, you're doing a good job. So,
yeah, I'm happy with where we are. I know we can do more, and that's what I consistently think about.
Man, I'd like to keep this thing going, but we do need to go ahead and and
that passed very quickly.
Yeah, cut this thing short. You do need to get going to your next assignment here. So I'll ask you the last two questions that I ask everybody that's on this show. The first of which is, what advice would you give to founders or soon-to-be founders that are going to be watching this program?
Make sure you really... The problem that you're solving is something that is a problem that you really, really, truly care about, because the founder journey is tough, right?
Mm-hmm.
The highs are high, but the lows are low, for sure. And when you think about the end vision, right? There's the poetry of what you want, and then there's the blood and sweat of how you get there, and it is challenging. So just make sure it is something you really care about, because it is going to be challenging. But if it's something you truly care about, it sort of blunts the challenges, and it makes it all the more worth it. The second thing is, and we talked about this at length earlier, is just how you build your team. Don't go down the path of least resistance, as tempting as it is. Be very thoughtful and deliberate about it, because what you don't want to do is build debt in your team that you need to pay off later because you didn't make the right calls early on.
Yeah, that's super important. And if you get that right at the beginning, you don't have to try and go back and change that later. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And then last, what is the best way for our viewers to get in touch with you if they so choose?
They are welcome to email me. My email is just malinka@akasa.com. That should be a fairly straightforward way to get to me.
Very good. Well, Malinka, thank you so much. That was a very quick hour, and I really appreciate your time, and you have a really good day.
Thanks. You too, bud.
All right.